The room didn't go quiet because someone dropped a glass. People at tables like this had seen broken crystal before. Expensive wine could be replaced. Tablecloths could be changed. Someone would joke about it tomorrow and move on. The silence came because a little boy in blue dinosaur pajamas climbed down from his chair, walked past a dozen millionaires who suddenly forgot their conversations, and wrapped both arms around the woman everyone else had spent the evening pretending not to notice. She was still holding the silver serving tray. Her fingers had gone so stiff around the handles that they had turned white. A streak of red wine spread across the white linen like spilled paint while guests avoided looking directly at her. The same way people often looked away when embarrassment belonged to someone else. At the other end of the table, Victoria Sinclair never lost her smile. It stayed perfectly in place, polished and practiced, even after she'd said, loud enough for every guest to hear, "This is exactly why staff should stay where they belong. Some people are only qualified to clean up messes, not prevent them." A few uneasy chuckles drifted around the table. Most people stared into their glasses instead. The woman holding the tray didn't defend herself. She simply whispered, "I'm so sorry." The apology barely carried across the room. Then came the sound nobody expected. Tiny footsteps against hardwood. The little boy stopped beside her and leaned both his arms around her leg as tightly as he could. His cheek pressed against the fabric of her uniform. He looked up, not at the guests, not at his father, but straight at Victoria. His small voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. He opened his mouth, and in the next few seconds, a room full of powerful people would be forced to see one another differently. Carl Whitfield slowly looked up from the business message glowing on his phone. For the first time that evening, he really saw the woman who had been standing only a few feet away all along. He saw the tears she was trying not to let fall. He saw his son refusing to let go of her. Then he looked at the woman sitting beside him, the woman he planned to marry. Something passed across his face so quickly that only the people closest to him noticed. Confusion, regret, recognition. Before we go back to the beginning, if stories about kindness, courage, and the quiet moments that change lives mean something to you, I'd be honored if you subscribed. Every story on this channel takes many hours of researching, writing, revising, and refining because I genuinely want to bring you stories that stay with you long after they're over. Thank you for spending your time here with me. It all began when Elena Vasquez first walked through the front doors of the Whitfield estate. She wasn't thinking about staying for years. She was thinking about rent, her father's medical bills back in Texas, and whether the family interviewing her would notice that she'd ironed the same blouse 3 times because it was the nicest one she owned. The house itself was larger than any place she'd ever stepped inside. Tall windows overlooked the Long Island Sound. Polished wood floors reflected the morning light, and fresh flowers sat on tables that probably cost more than her car. Mrs. Whitfield greeted her before anyone else could. "Elena?" she asked with a warm smile. "Yes, ma'am." She shook her head gently. "It's Sarah. If you're going to help take care of my little tornado, I think we're past ma'am." Before Elena could answer, a tiny blur raced across the hallway. A little boy with dark curls nearly crashed into her knees while clutching a stuffed elephant by one ear. "I'm faster than Daddy," he shouted over his shoulder. Carl Whitfield appeared a second later, already dressed for work, tie hanging loosely around his neck. "I seriously doubt that. You cheat. I have longer legs." Oliver crossed his arms with all the determination a 3-year-old could manage. "You still cheat." Sarah laughed so hard she had to wipe beneath one eye. Elena couldn't help smiling. The interview barely lasted 20 minutes. Most of it wasn't about experience. Sarah wanted to know how Elena handled nightmares, whether she believed children should apologize because they were told to, or because they understood why, and what kind of books she liked reading aloud. When Elena admitted she still remembered every bedtime story her grandmother had told her growing up, Sarah smiled as though she'd already made her decision. "We're not looking for someone perfect," she said. "We're looking for someone who'll love our son even on the days he isn't easy." Elena looked toward Oliver, who was now trying to convince his father that dinosaurs would make excellent pets. "I think I can do that." She had no idea how much those words would come to mean. The first 2 years passed in the comfortable rhythm that families build without realizing they're building it. Every weekday started the same way. Elena arrived before sunrise. Oliver hated waking up, so she'd sit beside his bed and whisper stories until his eyes slowly opened. Some mornings she'd invent adventures about pirate ships sailing through clouds. Other mornings she'd claim his cereal was secretly fuel for astronauts. He believed every word. By the time Carl came downstairs with coffee in one hand and car keys in the other, Oliver was usually dressed, laughing, and trying to convince Elena that socks were optional. "They're absolutely not optional," she'd tell him. "What if I'm wearing superhero feet today? Superheroes wear socks too. Batman doesn't. You've never seen Batman without his boots." Oliver would stop and think about that. Good point. Carl often watched those conversations for a second before heading out the door. "I don't know how you win these arguments." "I don't always." "You do." She smiled. "I just negotiate with very stubborn clients." Carl laughed. "Sounds like my board meetings." Then he was gone. Most days before 7, usually home after 8, sometimes later. The company demanded more hours than the clock seemed willing to give him. Sarah used to complain about it with a teasing smile. "You know," she'd tell him over dinner, "Oliver's going to start sending calendar invitations if he wants to see you." Carl would promise to do better. Sometimes he did. Sometimes work won. Life kept moving anyway. Everything changed quietly. Not with sirens, not with dramatic speeches. Just appointments that became more frequent. A scarf Sarah started wearing indoors. Meals she barely touched. One afternoon, Elena found Oliver sitting outside his mother's bedroom with his stuffed elephant tucked under one arm. "Mommy says she's tired." Elena crouched beside him. "She is. Can I fix it?" The question landed between them like something too fragile to touch. She brushed his curls back from his forehead. "I think the best thing you can do is keep loving her." "I already do." "I know." He nodded as though that settled everything. Children often believed love could repair what medicine couldn't. Sometimes adults wished they believed it too. The months that followed blurred into hospital visits, whispered phone calls, and evenings when the house felt strangely careful, as though everyone inside was afraid of making too much noise. Elena wasn't family. She reminded herself of that often. But somehow she found herself cooking dinners when no one remembered to eat, reading bedtime stories while Carl sat beside his wife's hospital bed, answering Oliver's questions when the answers were impossible. "Why does Mommy sleep so much?" "Her body's working very hard." "When will it stop working hard?" "I don't know, sweetheart." He accepted that answer because children can hear honesty long before they understand it. Sarah passed away on a gray afternoon in October. The trees outside had just begun turning gold. The house filled with flowers. Visitors came carrying casseroles, sympathy cards, and quiet voices. Then, just as quickly, they stopped coming. The flowers wilted. The cards were stacked away. Life expected everyone to continue. Oliver didn't understand why. He wandered the halls asking if his mom would still know where to find him. He refused to let anyone wash the last blanket she tucked around him. Some nights he cried until exhaustion finally won. Other nights he didn't cry at all. Those were the nights that worried Elena the most. She'd sit beside his bed after he'd fallen asleep, gently smoothing the blanket over his shoulders. Sometimes he'd reach for her hand without opening his eyes. She never pulled away. Carl tried. No one could honestly say he didn't. He took a month away from work, canceled meetings, ignored calls, made pancakes that came out shaped like continents instead of circles. Oliver laughed anyway. But grief has a way of following people into ordinary moments. Soon the emails returned, then the flights, then the late-night meetings. Responsibility pulled Carl back toward the city one day at a time until Elena once again became the steady rhythm inside the house. She packed lunches, helped with homework, sat through thunderstorms when Oliver insisted lightning sounded lonely. She learned exactly how much cinnamon he liked in his oatmeal, which night light bulb made his room feel safest, how to tell, just by the way he closed the front door after school, whether he'd had a wonderful day or a terrible one. Without anyone planning it, she became the constant presence in his life, the person who always came when he called, the person who remembered, the person who stayed. And somewhere beyond the gates of the quiet Greenwich neighborhood, a woman named Victoria Sinclair was about to step into their lives, carrying a smile that seemed warm enough to fool almost everyone. By the time Oliver turned 7, most people assumed Elena was a relative. It happened at the grocery store more than once. Cashiers would smile at the two of them and say, "He has your eyes." Elena always smiled politely. "Oh, I'm just looking after him." Oliver would wrinkle his nose every time he heard her say it. On the drive home one afternoon, he sat quietly in the back seat, looking out the window as the trees slipped by. "Why do you always say just?" She glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "Say what?" "Just looking after me." "Because it's true." He thought about that for a moment. "I don't think it's just." She didn't answer right away. The light turned red, and she rested her hands on the steering wheel. "Some jobs are special, Ollie. So are some people." When the light changed, they kept driving. Neither of them brought it up again, but the conversation stayed with her longer than she expected. The Whitfield house had changed over the years in ways visitors couldn't see. The furniture was the same. The paintings still hung in their familiar places. Fresh flowers still appeared every Monday. But the sound of the house was different. There was no piano drifting through the evenings anymore. Sarah had been the one who played after dinner, never for an audience, only because she loved it. Now the music came from Oliver, not through an instrument, but through his endless questions. "Why do birds sleep standing up?" "They don't all sleep standing up." "Then why do flamingos do it?" "I'll look it up after dinner." "Do fish get thirsty?" "I think you've officially asked the hardest question of the day." He grinned. "I was saving it." Some nights Carl was home in time to hear those conversations. He'd loosen his tie, pour himself a cup of coffee instead of the whiskey he'd once reached for, and listen from the kitchen doorway. "You've got an answer for everything," he said to Elena one evening. She laughed. "I absolutely do not." "Oliver thinks you do." She looked over at the boy, who was carefully arranging blueberries into the shape of a smiley face on his pancakes. "I've learned that sometimes children don't need perfect answers." Carl nodded slowly. "They just need someone who stays long enough to hear the questions." For a brief second, their eyes met. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't awkward. It was simply the quiet understanding of two people who had carried the same child through different kinds of grief. Then Oliver looked up. "Dad." "Yeah, buddy? You're smiling." "I am." "You haven't smiled at pancakes in forever." Carl looked down at his plate and chuckled. "I guess I haven't." Saturday mornings belonged to the three of them whenever Carl wasn't traveling. There was an unspoken routine. Oliver would wake everyone far too early. Carl would pretend to complain. Elena would make pancakes while Oliver insisted on flipping one himself, usually sending it somewhere other than the pan. The first time one landed on the floor, Oliver stared at it in horror. "I ruined breakfast." Elena picked it up before the dog could. "No, you ruined one pancake." "That's different." "Very." She mixed another batch of batter and handed him the spatula again. "We don't stop learning because something falls." Carl watched from the counter. "You always do that." She looked over. "Do what?" "You never make mistakes feel expensive." The words slipped out before he could stop them. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Elena shrugged gently. Children remember how adults react long after they forget what went wrong. Carl looked toward his son, who was concentrating so hard on the next pancake that the tip of his tongue peeked out between his lips. "I wish I'd learned that sooner." As Oliver grew older, he began noticing things children often miss. He noticed Elena always packed her own lunch instead of eating the food prepared for the family. He noticed she wore the same winter coat for several years. He noticed she drove an aging sedan whose heater worked only when it felt like cooperating. One December afternoon, they stopped outside a bakery after school. Oliver pressed his nose against the window. "Those cinnamon rolls look amazing." "They do. Let's get one." Elena checked her watch. "We've got dinner waiting at home." He looked at her instead of the pastries. "You don't have enough money today, do you?" She blinked. Children had an uncanny way of arriving at the truth without anyone pointing them there. "I have enough," she said softly. "I'm just trying to be careful." Oliver nodded. Then he reached into the pocket of his little backpack and pulled out 3 crumpled dollar bills and a handful of coins. "I've been saving." "For what?" "I don't know." He placed the money in her hand. "Now I know." She looked down at the worn bills before gently folding his fingers back over them. "Keep saving." "But I want to buy you one too." The words caught her off guard. She swallowed and smiled. "Then let's make a deal." "What kind?" "When you grow up and get your very first paycheck, you can buy me the biggest cinnamon roll in Connecticut." His face lit up. "Deal." He held out his pinky. She hooked hers around it. Carl happened to pull into the parking lot just in time to see them laughing outside the bakery. Their pinkies linked like they were sealing the most important contract in the world. He smiled without realizing it. For reasons he couldn't quite explain, that simple moment stayed with him through the rest of the week. A few months later, the invitations began arriving. Cream-colored envelopes, gold lettering, charity galas, private dinners, fundraisers. Carl's assistant mentioned one name more often than the others. "Victoria Sinclair." "She's brilliant," the assistant said one afternoon while reviewing Carl's calendar. "Everyone says the two of you work a room the same way." Carl barely looked up from the report in front of him. "Do they? They're already wondering when you'll start attending events together." He gave a distracted smile. "I think they're getting ahead of themselves." Maybe they were. Maybe they weren't. Because somewhere across town, Victoria was already hearing stories about the widowed billionaire with impeccable manners, an influential company, and a house where one employee seemed far more important than her job title suggested. She was curious, more curious than anyone realized. Before we continue, I'd love to hear what you think. Who do you trust the most so far, Elena, Carl, or someone else? And what do you think Victoria's first impression of the Whitfield family will be? Let me know in the comments. Carl met Victoria Sinclair on a Thursday evening in Manhattan. The event was hosted in a glass-walled ballroom overlooking the city, where conversations floated between discussions of philanthropy and investment portfolios. Waiters moved through the crowd with silver trays, and every introduction seemed to begin with someone's title before their name. Carl had almost skipped it. His assistant had reminded him twice that his presence mattered. "It'll be 2 hours," she promised. "Smile, shake hands, come home." He sighed. "I've heard that before." She smiled. "And yet you always end up staying." She wasn't wrong. Half an hour after arriving, Carl found himself standing beside a display of architectural models when a woman approached with effortless confidence. "You must be Carl Whitfield." He turned. Victoria Sinclair extended her hand. She was elegant without appearing overdressed. Her navy evening gown was understated, her jewelry tasteful rather than extravagant, and there was a calm certainty in the way she carried herself. "I've heard we're both impossible to schedule." Carl shook her hand. "I was told the same thing about you. Then perhaps our assistants should become friends." He laughed. "I suspect they've already exchanged numbers." The conversation came easily. They spoke about shipping routes, economic trends, and a children's literacy foundation both of their companies supported. Victoria listened carefully, asked thoughtful questions, and never seemed interested in impressing anyone. By the end of the evening, Carl found himself enjoying the first conversation he'd had in years that wasn't interrupted by his phone. As they walked toward the valet, Victoria glanced at him. "I hope this doesn't sound insensitive." "Go ahead. I know people must still compare everyone to your wife." Carl looked ahead for a moment. "They do. I won't." It wasn't a grand promise. She simply said it and let the silence settle between them. For the first time since Sarah's passing, Carl wondered if moving forward didn't necessarily mean leaving the past behind. Their relationship developed slowly. Dinner became coffee, coffee became charity events became weekends when Carl didn't have Oliver. Victoria never pressured him. If he canceled because Oliver had a school play or wasn't feeling well, she simply said, "Family first," and meant it. At least that's how it seemed. One Sunday afternoon, Carl invited her to the house. "I'd like you to meet someone," he said. Victoria smiled. "I've been looking forward to that." Oliver stood in the foyer holding a book almost as big as his chest. Carl knelt beside him. "Buddy, this is Victoria." Oliver looked up politely. "Hi." "Hi, Oliver," Victoria said warmly. "Your dad says you love dinosaurs. I like space more now." "Oh, Dad says space is bigger." Victoria laughed. "He's right." The conversation lasted only a few minutes before Oliver excused himself. "I'm building a Mars base with Ellie." Victoria blinked. "Ellie?" Before Carl could answer, Elena appeared from the hallway carrying a basket of freshly folded laundry. She paused when she saw the guests. "Oh, hello." Carl stood. "Victoria, this is Elena Vasquez." Victoria smiled. "It's nice to meet you." "You too." Their handshake was brief, professional, perfectly polite. But Victoria noticed something that unsettled her. Oliver had walked straight past his father, straight past her. He reached Elena instead. Without thinking, he slipped his hand into hers. "I found the glue." "Wonderful," Elena replied. "Let's see if Mars survives this experiment." The two disappeared upstairs together. Victoria watched them until they were out of sight. Then she looked back at Carl. "They're close." Carl smiled without hesitation. "She practically raised him." Victoria nodded. "I can see that." Her expression remained pleasant, but something behind her eyes became thoughtful. Over the following months, Victoria visited more often. She learned where everything was kept, which coffee Carl preferred, which room had the best afternoon light. She remembered birthdays, sent thoughtful gifts, and charmed nearly everyone she met. The house staff liked her. She always said thank you. She learned names quickly. She never raised her voice. Even Elena found it difficult to dislike her. There was nothing openly rude about Victoria, nothing obvious. It was smaller than that. One afternoon Elena brought tea into the library. Victoria accepted the cup with a smile. "Thank you." As Elena turned to leave, Victoria added gently, "Actually, could you bring lemon instead?" "Of course." When Elena returned with fresh slices, Victoria looked at the tray. "I think these are a little thick." "I'm sorry. I'll cut thinner ones." "No rush." She smiled again. "I just like things done a certain way." The exchange lasted less than 2 minutes. Anyone watching would have called it harmless. But it became a pattern. The flowers were arranged a little too full. The napkins were folded slightly uneven. The soup was a touch warm. Never complaints, always observations, always delivered with impeccable manners. Carl rarely noticed. To him, Victoria simply had high standards. Elena adjusted quietly and kept working. Oliver noticed. Children often did. One evening he sat at the kitchen island coloring while Elena prepared vegetables for dinner. "Why does Victoria always tell you to do things again?" Elena kept slicing carrots. "Sometimes people have different preferences." "She never tells Dad to do things again." She smiled softly. "Your father doesn't usually make the tea." Oliver frowned at his drawing. "I don't like it." She set the knife down. "Sweetheart." "No." He looked up at her. "I don't like when people act nice but make you sad." The words hung in the kitchen. Elena hadn't realized he'd seen that much. She crouched beside him. "I'm okay." "You don't look okay." Adults often forgot that children measured feelings differently, not by words, but by shoulders that seemed heavier, by smiles that disappeared a little too quickly, by the quiet after someone left the room. She brushed a strand of hair away from his forehead. "You don't need to worry about me." "I already do." A week later, Carl invited Victoria to Oliver's school spring concert. The auditorium buzzed with parents balancing bouquets and cameras. Oliver spotted them from backstage. He waved enthusiastically, first at his father, then at Elena, who stood a few rows behind because she insisted family should have the better seats. Victoria followed Oliver's gaze. "You should sit with us." Elena smiled. "I'm fine here. I insist." Before Elena could answer, another parent leaned over. "Oh, you must be Oliver's mother." Victoria opened her mouth. So did Elena. Neither spoke. Oliver solved it himself. From the stage, he pointed toward Elena with a huge grin and shouted loud enough for half the auditorium to hear. "That's my Ellie." Several parents smiled. One laughed. Victoria forced a polite smile, but she felt the familiar tightening in her chest. She wasn't jealous of Elena's job. She wasn't even jealous of Sarah's memory. What troubled her was something harder to define. Every room she entered seemed to have invisible lines already drawn. And somehow, Elena always stood inside the circle that mattered most. As summer approached, Carl made an announcement over dinner. He looked unusually nervous. Oliver noticed first. "Dad." Carl smiled. "I have some news." Victoria reached across the table and rested her hand lightly over his. He looked at her before turning back to his son. "I've asked Victoria to marry me." For a moment, the room was perfectly still. Then Oliver looked at Elena. Not his father, not Victoria. Elena smiled gently. "That's wonderful news." Oliver looked back at Carl. "If it makes you happy." Carl's smile softened. "It does." Oliver nodded, but he didn't say anything else. Later that night, after everyone had gone upstairs, Victoria stood alone in the dining room, looking around the house that would soon become hers. She imagined hosting holiday dinners, board meetings, charity galas, everything in its proper place. Then her eyes drifted toward the hallway, where she could hear Elena laughing quietly with Oliver as she tucked him into bed. Victoria folded her arms. Almost to herself, she whispered, "Some things are going to have to change." The hallway grew quiet. The house, however, seemed to hear every word. The engagement brought more visitors to the Whitfield estate than Elena had seen in years. Interior designers arrived with fabric samples tucked beneath their arms. Florists carried books thick with photographs of centerpieces. Event planners walked through every room with measuring tapes, talking about guest flow and lighting as though they were preparing for a royal reception instead of a wedding. The house never seemed to rest. One Monday morning, Elena was setting fresh flowers in the front hall when Victoria stepped inside with a woman carrying a leather portfolio. "Elena," Victoria called pleasantly. Elena turned. "Good morning. This is Margaret. She's helping me redesign a few rooms." Margaret smiled politely before opening the portfolio. Victoria pointed toward the sitting room. "I'd like to make this space more formal." Elena nodded. "It doesn't get used very often." "Exactly." Victoria looked around the room. "The toys, the books, the blanket basket. I'd rather keep those upstairs." Elena glanced toward the small reading corner beneath the window. That corner wasn't there because of convenience. Sarah had created it years earlier so she could read to Oliver while the afternoon sun poured through the glass. Even after Sarah passed away, Oliver still curled up there with Elena after school. "It's his favorite spot," Elena said carefully. Victoria smiled. "And he'll have another favorite." Her voice remained calm. "It isn't really appropriate for the main sitting room to look like a playroom." Elena understood what she was saying. This wasn't about furniture, it was about whose memories stayed in the room. "I'll move everything this afternoon." "Thank you." Victoria walked away before Elena could see the brief satisfaction on her face. When Oliver came home from school, he stopped in the doorway. His books were gone. The little basket holding his favorite blankets had disappeared. Even the framed drawing he'd made for Sarah years ago had been taken down. He stood there without speaking. Elena was carrying the last box upstairs when she noticed him. "I put everything in the playroom." He looked around again. "It doesn't smell the same." She smiled sadly. "I suppose it doesn't." He walked over to the empty corner and sat on the hardwood floor. "I used to read to Mom here." The words were quiet enough that they almost disappeared into the room. Then he looked up at Elena. "Can we still read here?" She hesitated. There wasn't a blanket anymore. No books, no pillows, only polished furniture arranged perfectly. She lowered herself onto the floor beside him anyway. "I think stories can be told anywhere." Oliver leaned against her shoulder. They sat there reading for nearly half an hour. When Victoria walked past the doorway, she paused. She didn't interrupt. She simply watched before continuing upstairs. Something about the scene unsettled her again. She couldn't explain why. The room looked exactly the way she'd wanted. Yet somehow it felt less like home. A few weeks later, Carl left for a 3-day business trip to Chicago. Before leaving, he kissed Victoria goodbye and crouched beside Oliver. "I'll be back Friday. You promised." "I know." Oliver wrapped his arms around him. "No canceling." "I won't." Carl looked toward Elena. "Thanks for holding everything together while I'm gone." She smiled. "We'll be fine." Victoria noticed the exchange. Carl trusted Elena without thinking. Not because she was an employee, because she was simply part of the rhythm of the house. That realization stayed with Victoria long after Carl's car disappeared down the driveway. On Wednesday evening, Oliver came home with a fever. Nothing serious, just enough to make his cheeks pink and his eyes heavy. Elena sat beside him most of the night, changing cool washcloths and reading softly whenever he drifted awake. Around midnight, Victoria stepped quietly into the room. "How is he?" "He'll be okay." Victoria looked at the thermometer. "I'll call his pediatrician first thing." "I already spoke to the after-hours nurse." Victoria blinked. "You did?" "She said to keep him hydrated and monitor his temperature." Victoria nodded. For a moment, she simply watched Elena gently brush damp curls away from Oliver's forehead. The movement was practiced, instinctive, the kind that came only after years of caring for the same child. Victoria suddenly felt like a guest standing in someone else's place. She hated the feeling. Not because Elena had done anything wrong, because she hadn't. The next morning, Oliver opened his eyes to find both women sitting in the room. Victoria held a cup of warm tea. Elena held a bowl of oatmeal. He looked from one to the other. "I only have to eat one breakfast, right?" Both women laughed. The tension eased for a second. Victoria handed him the tea. "I added honey." Elena smiled. "And I didn't tell her you secretly like extra cinnamon." Oliver grinned. "I do." Victoria looked surprised. "I didn't know that." "You will," Elena said kindly. "It just takes time." The words were meant with generosity. Victoria heard something else. Time. Years she could never reclaim. Memories she could never recreate. Inside her chest, insecurity quietly became resentment. As the wedding drew closer, Victoria began taking greater control of the household. She reviewed staff schedules, approved menus, changed uniforms, ordered new china. Everything she did made practical sense. No single decision seemed unreasonable. Yet together they changed the atmosphere of the house. One afternoon she gathered the staff in the kitchen. "I'd like everyone in matching uniforms during formal events." The housekeeper nodded. The gardener shrugged. Elena glanced down at the sample Victoria handed her. It was crisp, elegant, and far less comfortable than what she normally wore while caring for Oliver. Victoria noticed her hesitation. "Is there a problem?" "No. I want the house to present a unified image." "I understand." "I'm glad." Again perfectly polite. Again impossible to argue with. That evening, Oliver found Elena folding the new uniform. "It looks uncomfortable." "It probably is." "Then don't wear it." She smiled. "Sometimes grown-ups wear uncomfortable things." "Why?" She laughed. "You'll understand someday." "I hope not." He reached into the closet and pulled out the old cardigan she always wore on chilly mornings. "You like this one?" "I do." "Then keep it." She gently folded it and placed it on the shelf. "I will." Neither of them noticed Victoria standing just outside the partially open door. She had come to ask about the weekend schedule. Instead, she watched Oliver carefully straighten Elena's cardigan before hugging her goodnight. It was such a small moment, so ordinary. Yet it stirred something she had tried not to acknowledge. She wasn't competing with Elena for Carl's affection. She was competing with years of quiet love that couldn't be bought, inherited, or arranged. And for the first time, she began wondering whether there was room for her in a family that already felt complete. 2 days later, invitations went out for an intimate dinner at the Whitfield estate. Investors, board members, old family friends, people whose opinions carried weight in both business and society. Victoria planned every detail herself. The menu, the seating chart, the flowers, the music. Nothing would be left to chance. As she reviewed the final checklist, she looked toward Elena. I'll need every member of the household helping that evening. Of course. The catering staff will handle most of it, but I'd like you serving in the dining room. Elena looked mildly surprised. I usually stay with Oliver. My mother will keep him occupied until dessert. There was a brief pause. Unless that's a problem. No, Elena answered quietly. I'll do whatever you need. Victoria smiled. I knew I could count on you. She walked away with her clipboard, satisfied that everything was finally under control. Behind her, Elena looked toward the dining room where the long mahogany table was already being prepared. For reasons she couldn't explain, a knot settled in her stomach. It was only a dinner, just one evening. Still, as she watched staff polish crystal glasses beneath the chandelier, she couldn't shake the feeling that something fragile was about to be tested. The afternoon of the dinner began before sunrise. By 6 o'clock, delivery trucks were already pulling through the front gates of the Whitfield estate. Florists carried in towering arrangements of white hydrangeas and cream roses. The catering company rolled stainless steel racks through the kitchen, while someone tested the string quartet's microphones in the ballroom. From the outside, everything looked effortless. Inside the house, every minute had a schedule. Elena tied her apron over a freshly pressed black uniform and checked the list taped beside the pantry door. Glassware, finished. Desserts, ready. Table settings, double-checked. She had worked through events before, but never one where Victoria had personally approved every detail. There was no room for mistakes. Not tonight. Oliver wandered into the kitchen just after breakfast, rubbing sleep from his eyes. He was still wearing plaid pajama pants and a faded t-shirt with a rocket ship across the front. Why does everybody look nervous? He asked. Elena smiled without looking up from the tray she was arranging. Big dinners make adults forget how to breathe. He laughed. So that's why Mr. Jenkins dropped all the forks. The older butler looked over from the counter. I was reorganizing. You dropped them. I reorganized them onto the floor. Oliver giggled. Even Mr. Jenkins smiled. For a few minutes, the kitchen felt normal again. Victoria entered a moment later with a clipboard tucked beneath her arm. She greeted everyone pleasantly before turning to Elena. The seating cards have been changed. I'll update them. And the Bordeaux should be served with the main course instead of before. I'll let the catering manager know. Victoria nodded. Thank you. She started to leave, then paused. Oh, and one more thing. Everyone looked up. I'd prefer the household staff to avoid unnecessary conversations with the guests. The room grew still. Victoria continued in the same calm tone. If anyone asks for assistance, of course, be polite. Otherwise, I'd like tonight to feel seamless. No one answered. There shouldn't be any distractions. She smiled. I know you'll all do wonderfully. When she left, Mr. Jenkins quietly cleared his throat. Well, he picked up another tray. Back to reorganizing. A few soft laughs broke the tension. Elena forced one too. By early evening, the estate glowed. Candles flickered beneath crystal chandeliers. The dining table stretched nearly the length of the room, covered in crisp white linen that reflected the warm light above it. Outside, the last streaks of sunset disappeared beyond the sound. Guests arrived one after another. Luxury cars curved through the driveway. Handshakes, laughter, business conversations that never quite stopped sounding like negotiations. Carl stood beside Victoria welcoming everyone. She looked composed, graceful, entirely in her element. When she slipped her hand through Carl's arm, photographers captured the moment from the front entrance. They looked like the perfect couple. Upstairs, Oliver watched from the landing. He wasn't invited to the formal dinner, but he liked watching the arrivals. They're dressed like they're going to the Oscars, he whispered. I don't think the Oscars have this many bow ties. He looked down toward the dining room. Will Dad be busy all night? Probably until everyone leaves. Oliver nodded. I'll wait up. You'll probably fall asleep first. I won't. She smiled. We'll see. Dinner began precisely at 7:30. The first course passed without incident, then the second. The conversations grew louder as the wine flowed. Carl discussed an upcoming acquisition with two investors. Victoria moved naturally from guest to guest, making everyone feel welcomed. From across the room, Elena watched the rhythm carefully. She carried trays in and out with the rest of the staff, barely noticed. Exactly as Victoria wanted. Halfway through the main course, one of the investors asked for another bottle of Bordeaux. Mr. Jenkins nodded toward Elena. Could you bring this one? Of course. She lifted the tray carefully, the bottle, fresh glasses, everything balanced perfectly. As she reached the table, one of the guests leaned back suddenly to laugh at something Carl had said. His chair brushed lightly against her hip. It wasn't hard, just enough. Her hand shifted. One wine glass tipped. It struck another. The sound was almost delicate, crystal tapping crystal. Then the deep red wine spilled across the white tablecloth, spreading toward one of the investors' dinner plate. For one heartbeat, nobody moved. Elena immediately set the tray down. I'm so sorry. She reached for a clean napkin. I'll fix it right away. It was an accident, one guest began. Before he could finish, Victoria stood. The scrape of her chair echoed through the dining room. She looked at the tablecloth, then at Elena. Her smile never disappeared. It simply became thinner. This, she said evenly, is exactly why details matter. Elena lowered her eyes. I'm very sorry. Victoria took the napkin from her hand. I know you are. She looked around the table, still smiling as though making harmless conversation. The help these days can't seem to understand that preventing a mess is always easier than cleaning one. A few guests shifted uncomfortably. Someone gave a nervous chuckle. No one spoke. Victoria continued. I suppose some people are simply better suited to cleaning up after everyone else. The words floated through the room with terrifying calm. No shouting, no anger, just enough volume for every person at the table to hear. Elena felt every pair of eyes settle on her. Her face burned. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. There was nothing she could say. If she defended herself, she embarrassed Carl. If she argued, she risked losing the job that had become more than a paycheck years ago. So she bent down quietly and began blotting the tablecloth. Her hands trembled despite every effort to steady them. A single tear escaped before she could stop it. It landed silently on the white linen beside the spilled wine. No one noticed, or perhaps they pretended not to. Carl looked up from the investor beside him. His attention had been split between business and dinner all evening. He had heard Victoria's words, but somehow they reached him a second too late, softened by the conversations around him. He frowned slightly. What happened? One investor answered awkwardly. Just a small spill. Carl nodded absent-mindedly. His phone buzzed beside his plate. Without thinking, he glanced down at the screen. A message from overseas. An urgent contract question. He answered it instinctively. Across the room, Elena saw him looking at his phone. Not at her. Not at what had just happened. She lowered her head again. The silence around the table somehow felt louder than the conversation had moments earlier. Near the doorway, Mr. Jenkins took one step forward, then stopped. He looked at Victoria, then at Carl, then back at Elena. He wanted to say something. He didn't. The rest of the staff remained perfectly still. Years of service had taught them the same lesson. Sometimes speaking cost more than silence. Elena finished blotting the tablecloth. It's clean enough, Victoria said coolly. You may step back now. Elena straightened slowly, still holding the damp napkin in her hand. She took one step away from the table, then another. Every instinct told her to leave the room before anyone saw the tears gathering in her eyes. She reached the doorway, and just as she did, she heard the unmistakable sound of a small chair scraping against the floor behind her. The sound was so unexpected that several guests turned before they realized where it had come from. Near the end of the table, a small wooden booster seat shifted backward. Oliver had been allowed to join the adults for dessert later that evening, and until then, he had been sitting quietly with Victoria's mother in the breakfast room just beyond the dining area. At some point, unnoticed in the commotion, he had wandered back in. He climbed down carefully, one sneaker touching the floor before the other. No one stopped him. No one even spoke. He looked around the room with the open confusion only a child could have. His eyes moved from the red stain on the tablecloth, to the damp napkin in Elena's hand, to the tear she hurriedly wiped away with the back of her wrist. He didn't understand business etiquette. He didn't understand social status. He only understood one thing. Ellie was crying. He started walking. His footsteps were soft against the hardwood floor, but in the silence, they sounded impossibly loud. One step, then another. He passed behind his father's chair, past investors who instinctively pulled their feet beneath the table, past crystal glasses and polished shoes. Nobody tried to stop him. Victoria watched him with polite confusion. "Oliver," she said gently. He didn't answer. He kept walking until he reached Elena. She looked down, startled. "Ollie!" Before she could say another word, he wrapped both arms around her waist and held on as tightly as he could. The tray slipped from her hand onto a nearby serving cart with a soft clatter. She instinctively placed one hand on his back. "What are you doing here, sweetheart?" she whispered. He didn't look at her. He looked across the room, straight at Victoria. His little face wasn't angry. It wasn't defiant. It was simply earnest. He spoke in the same voice he used when asking for another bedtime story. "Ellie's not the help." Nobody moved. He tightened his arms around Elena. "Ellie's my mom." The words landed without force, without drama. And somehow they carried more weight than anyone in the room knew how to hold. The quartet in the next room had stopped playing. One violinist still held her bow in the air, frozen. A waiter stood motionless with a coffee pot halfway raised. Across the table, an investor quietly removed his glasses. Nobody seemed certain what to do next. Elena felt her throat tighten. She lowered herself until she was kneeling in front of Oliver. She cupped his face gently. "I'm not your mom, sweetheart. You are." His eyes filled with tears. "You tuck me in." She smiled through her own tears. "You stay when I have bad dreams." Her lips trembled. "I try. You know where my dinosaur is when I lose him." A few quiet smiles appeared around the table. Oliver wasn't finished. "You know how much cinnamon I like." Someone quietly looked down at their plate. "You know when I miss mommy." His voice became softer. "You know before I say anything." Elena closed her eyes for just a second. When she opened them again, tears were running freely down her cheeks. She brushed his curls back exactly the way she had done hundreds of times before. "I love you very much. I know." He reached up and wiped away one of her tears with his tiny thumb. "So why's that lady making you cry?" The question settled over the room. No accusation, no anger, just honest confusion. Children often ask the questions adults spent entire evenings avoiding. Carl slowly lowered his phone onto the table. The overseas message was still open on the screen. He hadn't read a single word after hearing Oliver speak. He looked at his son. Really looked. Then at Elena. Her shoulders were shaking ever so slightly as she tried to compose herself. He noticed things he should have seen years ago. The way Oliver instinctively reached for her whenever he was frightened. The familiar way she rested her hand against his back. The quiet trust between them that needed no explanation. Then Carl looked at the damp napkin still clutched in Elena's hand. Only then did he notice the red wine soaking through it. He looked at the tablecloth, at the uncomfortable faces around him. Finally, he looked at Victoria. What happened? This time, nobody answered for her. The silence itself became the answer. Mr. Jenkins stepped forward. His voice was respectful. "Sir." Carl turned. "It was an accident." Mr. Jenkins chose each word carefully. A guest leaned back unexpectedly. Carl glanced toward the investor, who immediately nodded. "He's right," the man said quietly. "It was my chair." Carl's eyes returned to Victoria. Then why is Elena apologizing? Carl stood. The movement echoed through the room. For years, people in boardrooms had learned to recognize that quiet tone in his voice. It usually came just before a decision no one could reverse. "Do you know," he said softly, "how many nights Elena slept in the chair beside Oliver's bed after Sarah died?" Victoria didn't answer. "Do you know who taught him to read when I was flying across the country trying to save a company that probably didn't need saving as much as my son needed me?" The room remained silent. Carl looked toward Elena. "I missed school plays." His voice caught. "I missed birthdays." He swallowed. "I even missed one Father's Day breakfast because I thought one more meeting couldn't possibly matter." He shook his head slowly. "But she was here." Elena lowered her eyes. "Carl." He looked back at Victoria. "She isn't just someone who works in this house." His eyes drifted to Oliver, who still refused to let go of Elena's hand. "She's one of the reasons my son still smiles." No one at the table spoke. Not because they didn't have opinions, because some truths arrive so plainly that interrupting them feels impossible. Victoria looked around the room. The investors weren't watching Elena anymore. They were watching her. For the first time that evening, she saw herself through someone else's eyes. Not as a poised hostess, not as a future Mrs. Whitfield, but as the person who had mistaken dignity for status and kindness for weakness. She looked at Oliver. He had tucked himself against Elena's side without the slightest hesitation. There wasn't a trace of performance in him, no calculation, no attempt to embarrass anyone. He had simply gone to the person who made him feel safe. Victoria's shoulders dropped almost imperceptibly. The perfect smile she had worn all evening disappeared, and in its place was something she hadn't allowed herself to show before: shame. No one hurried to fill the silence. For a room that had been full of conversation only minutes earlier, it was remarkable how quickly people discovered that some moments deserved nothing added to them. Victoria looked down at her hands. She had spent months making sure every detail of the evening reflected perfection. The flowers were exactly where she wanted them. The place settings matched. The wine had been chosen years in advance. And yet the only thing anyone would remember was a little boy standing beside the woman who had loved him long before anyone thought to applaud her for it. She took a slow breath, then another. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than it had been all evening. Elena looked up. Victoria didn't step behind Carl. She didn't try to explain herself. She walked around the table until they were standing only a few feet apart. "I owe you an apology." No one interrupted. Victoria looked at the damp napkin still resting in Elena's hand. "I told myself I was protecting the standards of this home." She gave a small, painful shake of her head. "What I was really protecting was my own fear." Carl watched her without speaking. Victoria continued. "I kept thinking that if everything looked perfect, if every room, every dinner, every event reflected who I thought I needed to be, eventually I'd feel like I belonged here." She looked toward Oliver. "But I forgot something." Oliver tilted his head. "A family isn't built by appearances." Her eyes returned to Elena. "It's built by the people who keep showing up." The words hung gently in the room. They weren't polished, they weren't rehearsed. For the first time since Elena had met her, Victoria sounded like someone who had stopped trying to win. "I'm sorry," she said again. This time without excuses. Elena stared at her for several seconds. She had imagined this evening ending in many different ways. Being dismissed, packing her belongings, trying to explain to Oliver why she couldn't come back. An apology had never crossed her mind. She looked at Victoria's face. The confidence was still there, but the certainty had disappeared. "I appreciate you saying that," Elena answered softly. "I don't expect you to forgive me tonight. You embarrassed me. I know. In front of people who don't know me. I know." Elena glanced at Oliver, who was still holding her hand, then back at Victoria. "I think what hurt the most wasn't what you called me. It was that, for a moment, I wondered if maybe I'd forgotten my place." Her voice trembled slightly. "Then this little boy reminded me." She smiled down at Oliver. "He reminded all of us." Oliver looked around the room. Did I? A few quiet laughs escaped through the tension. Mr. Jenkins smiled openly for the first time all evening. I believe you did, young man. One of the investors, an older woman who had remained silent throughout dinner, slowly placed her napkin beside her plate. She looked toward Elena. My name is Rebecca.
Elena nodded politely. I'm Elena.
Rebecca smiled. I know. She paused. Carl has mentioned you over the years. Carl looked surprised. I have. More than you realize. She turned back to Elena. You always appeared in your stories. Elena frowned slightly. I did. Rebecca nodded. Elena handled it. Elena stayed with Oliver. You never noticed because you weren't in the room. Carl leaned back slowly. He searched his memory. She was right. He had spoken about Elena dozens of times without thinking. Never as an employee, always as someone he relied on. He closed his eyes briefly. How had he failed to see what those words meant? Victoria noticed the expression on Carl's face. You already knew, she said quietly. He looked at her. I don't think I did. You trusted her with the most important person in your life. I did. You spoke about her with gratitude. I did. But you never stopped to ask whether she felt valued. Carl didn't answer, because there wasn't one. He stood and walked toward Elena. Oliver stepped aside just enough for him to reach her. Carl looked at the woman who had carried so much of his family's grief while asking for so little in return.
I'm sorry.
She blinked. You don't have to. Yes. His voice was steady. I should have looked up sooner. Elena lowered her eyes. You've had a lot on your shoulders. So did you. He shook his head. The difference is, everyone thanked me for carrying mine. The room fell silent again. Carl extended his hand. Not as an employer, not as a businessman, simply as a man trying to acknowledge something he should have acknowledged years earlier. Thank you. Elena looked at his hand for a moment before taking it. You don't owe me thanks. Their handshake lasted only a second. Yet somehow it felt more meaningful than any contract Carl had signed in years. Dinner never resumed the way it had been planned. No one seemed interested in discussing acquisitions or market forecasts anymore. Instead, conversations became quieter, more personal. Guests drifted into the sitting room with coffee cups instead of wine glasses. Someone asked Oliver about his Mars base. Another guest wanted to know how Elena had convinced him to enjoy reading. Even Victoria's mother wandered over to Elena. I've heard so much about you, she said gently. I hope only good things. The older woman glanced toward her daughter before answering. Not enough good things. Across the room, Victoria watched the exchange. For the first time since becoming engaged, she understood something she had missed from the beginning. Respect couldn't be arranged through seating charts. It wasn't created by expensive dinners or flawless etiquette. It grew quietly, one ordinary act of care at a time. And the woman she had tried so hard to reduce to the help had earned the respect of nearly everyone in the room without ever asking for it. As the last guests prepared to leave, the stain on the tablecloth had already been removed. No trace of the spilled wine remained. But every person who walked out of the Whitfield home carried something else with them. Not the memory of a mistake. The memory of a child who had reminded a room full of successful adults what love looked like when it wasn't trying to impress anyone. The house felt unusually quiet the next morning. Not the heavy silence that had settled there after Sarah passed away. This was different. It was the kind of quiet that followed an honest conversation, when everyone was still turning over the same memories, trying to understand them from a new angle. Sunlight stretched across the kitchen floor as Elena poured pancake batter into the skillet. The familiar smell of butter and cinnamon drifted through the room. Oliver wandered in first, his hair sticking up in every direction. He climbed onto his usual stool and rested his chin in his hands. Are we okay? Elena looked at him and smiled. I think we're getting there. He nodded as if that answer made perfect sense. I dreamed about the dinner. Oh, you cried again. She reached over and squeezed his hand. But then I woke up. A moment later, Carl stepped into the kitchen. For years, mornings had begun the same way. Coffee, emails, a quick breakfast, a rushed goodbye before heading to the city. Today, his phone stayed in his pocket. He stood there for a few seconds, simply watching Elena flip a pancake while Oliver tried to steal blueberries from the bowl. It struck him how many mornings exactly like this he had missed without ever realizing they were the foundation of his son's childhood. "Need another pair of hands?" he asked. "Only if you're willing to risk burning breakfast." Oliver gasped dramatically. "Dad's pancake curse." Carl smiled. "I've improved." "We'll see," Oliver replied. The three of them laughed together. It wasn't a grand moment. It was ordinary. Carl finally understood how precious ordinary could be. Later that afternoon, Victoria asked Elena if they could talk. Not in Carl's office, not in the formal sitting room. She chose the small garden behind the house where Sarah had once planted lavender. The flowers swayed gently in the summer breeze, filling the air with a faint, familiar scent. Victoria stood waiting with 2 mugs of tea. "I wasn't sure which one you liked." "You remembered." "I asked Mrs. Jenkins." They sat on the garden bench for a moment without speaking. Victoria looked down at her cup. "I've been thinking about something all night. I spent so much energy trying to earn a place in this family that I started treating belonging like a competition." She looked toward the house. But Oliver never saw it that way.
No.
He didn't have 2 sides. Elena shook her head. "Children usually don't." Victoria let out a slow breath. "I think I was trying to replace Sarah." The words were barely above a whisper. "I kept telling myself I wasn't." She looked at Elena. "But every room reminded me someone had loved this family before I arrived." Elena looked toward the lavender. "Sarah never wanted to be replaced." Victoria frowned slightly. "How do you know?" "Because she told me." Victoria turned to her. "A few weeks before she passed away." Elena's voice remained gentle. "She asked me for one promise." "What was it?" She said, "Don't let Oliver grow up believing he has to stop loving me before he can love someone else." Victoria's eyes filled. Elena continued, "Love doesn't work that way." For several seconds, Victoria couldn't speak. She covered her eyes briefly before letting out an unsteady laugh. "I wish someone had told me that months ago. I think someone just did." That evening, Carl found an old cardboard box in the attic. It held photographs, school drawings, birthday cards, and small things he hadn't touched since Sarah's funeral. He carried it downstairs and set it on the coffee table. Oliver looked up. "Mom's box." Carl nodded. "It shouldn't stay hidden anymore." They opened it together. Oliver held up a finger painting from preschool. "I made Dad green." "You did. I thought you liked green." "I still do." Another photograph showed Sarah sitting in the reading corner with Oliver asleep across her lap. "I took that picture." Carl looked at her. "I'm glad you did." Victoria sat beside them. She studied the photograph for a long moment. Instead of feeling threatened by it, she smiled. "She looks happy." Carl nodded. She was. Victoria reached for another picture. "I'd like Oliver to keep these where he can see them." Oliver looked at her. "Really?" "Of course." She smiled. "Your mom will always be part of this house." Oliver thought for a second before scooting closer to Victoria. "Can I show you the story she used to read me?" "I'd love that." He disappeared upstairs and returned with a worn picture book whose corners had softened from years of little hands turning the pages. Victoria accepted it carefully. "It's well loved." "It is." Oliver looked at Elena. "Ellie knows all the voices." "Then I think we'll need her help. I suppose I can do one more reading." The 4 of them settled into the reading corner. Not because the furniture had returned exactly as it once was, but because Carl had quietly asked for Oliver's blanket basket and books to be brought back downstairs that morning. The room no longer looked like a showroom. It looked lived in again. Halfway through the story, Carl noticed something that made him smile. Oliver had leaned against Victoria's shoulder. Without thinking, he had reached his hand toward Elena. She took it naturally while continuing the story. No one seemed to find it unusual. There was enough room for everyone. Several weeks later, The Whitfield Foundation hosted its annual children's literacy fundraiser. As guests gathered, Carl stepped onto the stage to give his opening remarks. He thanked sponsors, volunteers, teachers. Then he paused. "There is one person I failed to recognize for far too long." Elena looked up from her seat, surprised. Carl smiled warmly. Some people change a child's life through one extraordinary moment. He looked toward her. Others do it through thousands of ordinary ones. The audience turned. Carl continued. "Oliver is the kind, curious young man he is today because someone chose to show up every single day, expecting nothing in return." He extended his hand toward Elena. "Thank you for helping raise my son." The applause began slowly, then spread across the room until everyone was standing. Elena lowered her head, embarrassed by the attention. Oliver couldn't have been prouder. He clapped harder than anyone. Victoria smiled through tears as she joined the standing ovation. Not because Elena had taken anything from her, but because, at last, everyone was honoring what had always been true. Love doesn't become smaller when it's shared. Sometimes it finally feels big enough for everyone. The months that followed didn't erase what had happened at that dinner. No one pretended they had. Instead, they let it become the moment that changed how they treated one another. Victoria no longer saw Elena as someone standing between her and the family. She saw her as someone who had helped keep that family standing until she arrived. And that changed everything. Nearly a year after that dinner, the Whitfield estate hosted another gathering. The guest list was just as impressive. Business leaders, old friends, neighbors, people who had once whispered about the evening when a child had stopped an entire room with a single sentence. This time, though, the atmosphere felt different before anyone even walked through the doors. The reading corner was back beneath the window. A basket of children's books sat beside it. Oliver's framed drawing had returned to the mantel. Nothing looked out of place. It looked like a home. As guests arrived, Oliver raced through the foyer carrying a tray of lemonade that was almost too heavy for him. Carl laughed. "Easy there, buddy. I've got it." Halfway across the room, Oliver's elbow bumped a glass. Tipped. Lemonade splashed across the edge of a side table. For a split second, everyone nearby froze. Then Oliver looked up nervously.
I'm sorry.
Carl walked over, picked up a napkin, and started wiping the table. "So," he said with a smile, "who's going to help me clean up this terrible disaster?" A few guests laughed softly. Before Oliver could answer, Victoria knelt beside him. She handed him another napkin. "You know something?" "What?" "The best people I know aren't the ones who never make mistakes." She smiled warmly. "They're the ones who help each other after they happen." Oliver's worried face relaxed. Together, the three of them cleaned the small spill in less than a minute. Across the room, Elena watched quietly. She caught Victoria's eye. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. Some apologies are made with words. The deepest ones are lived. Later that evening, as the last guests drifted into the garden, Oliver slipped his hand into Elena's. He looked up at her with the same open smile he had worn since he was little. "Remember our deal?" She laughed. "The cinnamon roll? I got my allowance today." She pretended to think very seriously. "I believe interest has been accumulating for several years." His eyes widened. "Does that mean I owe you too?" "I think that's exactly what it means." He groaned dramatically, making everyone around him laugh. Carl watched the scene from the porch. Victoria slipped her hand into his. "What are you smiling about?" she asked. He looked toward the people who had become the heart of his home. "I'm thinking that families aren't always the people who arrive first." He paused, watching Oliver chatter excitedly as Elena listened with the same patient smile she had carried for years. "Sometimes they're the people who choose to stay." As the evening settled into a peaceful hush, the lights from the house reflected across the water, and the laughter drifting through the open windows sounded exactly the way a home should. If this story touched your heart, I'd truly appreciate it if you left a like. It helps the story reach more people who might need a reminder that kindness, loyalty, and quiet acts of love still matter. I'd also love to hear from you in the comments. Which moment stayed with you the most? Was it Oliver's brave words at the dinner table, Victoria's heartfelt apology, or Carl finally seeing what had always been right in front of him? And if you enjoy uplifting stories about compassion, hope, second chances, and the unexpected ways ordinary people change lives, I'd be honored to have you subscribe and join us for the next one. Thank you, from the bottom of my heart, for choosing to spend your time with this story. I hope you carry a little of its warmth with you long after the screen goes dark.